DNA is not only a chemical molecule that determines our eye color or blood type. It is the very foundation of life, a code that contains the instructions for building and operating the entire organism. Yet as science develops, more questions arise. Could DNA be not only the carrier of biological information but also a kind of archive of memory for our lineage? Is it possible that within its structures lie echoes of ancestral experiences that we unconsciously reproduce? What we know for certain about DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid DNA, is a long double helix composed of 4 types of nucleotides: adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. Their sequences form genes, the instructions for producing proteins that define the structure and function of cells. DNA is stored in the cell nucleus and is copied with each cell division, passed on from parents to children. In this sense, we truly carry within us fragments of our ancestors' biological code. But does that mean we inherit their memories as well? Literally no. The genetic code does not store childhood images of a great-grandfather or stories from his life. However, modern research suggests that DNA may reflect something deeper: the lived experience, encoded in predispositions and reactions. Epigenetics, the key to generational memory. Traditionally, DNA was considered stable, changing only through mutations, but in the 21st century, a new field, epigenetics, emerged. It shows that inheritance is influenced not only by genes themselves, but also by chemical tags on DNA that switch genes on or off depending on life conditions. For example, chronic stress, malnutrition, or traumatic events can leave marks in the form of epigenetic modifications. These can be passed down to offspring, shaping their physiology and even their behavior. Children and grandchildren of people who survived famine or war sometimes show a different sensitivity to stress or higher risks of certain diseases, even if they themselves never experienced such hardships. This resembles memory not as vivid stories, but as imprints of survival strategies preserved at the molecular level, experiments that challenge our view. Several studies support the possibility of inherited memory. One of the most famous was conducted on mice in 2013. Scientists exposed mice to the smell of flowers paired with mild electric shocks. Later, the offspring of these mice who had never experienced the shocks also showed fear when exposed to the same scent. This suggests that information about traumatic experience was transmitted via DNA or epigenetic mechanisms. Similar conclusions are drawn from research on humans. Descendants of Holocaust or Holodomor survivors sometimes display heightened anxiety or altered stress responses. These are not literal memories but echoes of ancestral trauma that shape the psyche. Myths versus reality. Despite the fascinating findings, it is important to separate science from fantasy. DNA does not contain a film reel of our ancestors' lives. We cannot recall our great-grandmother's first love or a battlefield through genetic memory. What we can inherit are biological mechanisms that reflect their survival experience. In other words, DNA is not a diary of the past but a book of instructions constantly edited based on how previous generations lived. It preserves not stories but tendencies, predispositions, and tuned responses to the world. The philosophical dimension, the idea of memory in DNA, also carries a profound philosophical meaning. If our ancestors' experiences truly leave marks on our heredity, then we are not isolated individuals but part of an unbroken chain of life. Within each of us are fragments of not only our family's story but also the entire human journey. After all, DNA itself is far older than any civilization. It carries the evolutionary memory of billions of years that made the existence of our cells possible. Can this memory be read? Scientists are now trying to understand how epigenetic marks affect behavior and health. It is already clear that our lifestyle, nutrition, stress, physical activity leaves traces that may be passed to future generations. In this sense, we do not only inherit memory, but also create it. Perhaps in the future, medicine will learn to erase harmful epigenetic marks or strengthen positive ones related to resilience, creativity, or learning ability. Then the concept of memory in DNA will gain a new, practical dimension. Conclusion: DNA is more than the code of life. While it does not preserve our ancestors' specific memories, It may carry the consequences of their experiences, especially trauma and stress. We cannot remember them the way we recall our childhood, but we do inherit biological echoes of the past that influence our health and behavior. Thus, the phenomenon of DNA reminds us that we are continuations of a story that began long before we were born, and our choices today may become the memory of generations yet to come.